Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really interesting set of material today. It's a read-ahead packet for something called the Spiritual Fitness Staff Ride.
Mm-hmm.
And the focus, it's not some huge famous battle. It's a skirmish from way, way back at the start of the American Civil War. Battle of Big Bethel.
Right. June 10th, 1861. And what's really fascinating here, I think, isn't just the history itself, though, we'll definitely get into the details.
Sure.
It's how this material uses that battle. It's a lens, really, to explore these timeless ethical dilemmas, leadership challenges, things that are still completely relevant today.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to pull out those crucial nuggets from the packet. What actually happened at Big Bethel.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts.
And why does this specific historical event matter now? What exactly is a staff ride anyway? And how does adding spiritual fitness kind of change the game?
Right.
Ultimately, we want to see what this, seemingly minor clash can teach you, our listener, about moral leadership, especially when you're under pressure. So let's dive in.
Okay.
So, to get started, we really need to set the scene. This packet, it takes us right back to that chaotic spring of 1861.
Yeah, everything's still very much up in the air. Fort Sumter has just fallen. Virginia has seceded.
Right.
And suddenly, this narrow strip of land, the Virginia Peninsula, it's nestled between the York and James Rivers, becomes incredibly important strategically.
It's basically the road to Richmond, the Confederate capital.
Exactly. Both sides knew that controlling it would be a huge advantage. Now, the Union had a foothold down at the tip at Fort Monroe. That was commanded by Major General Benjamin Butler.
Okay.
And the Confederates, they were led by Colonel John B. Magruder. He was scrambling, trying to build up defenses to stop any Union advance up that peninsula.
And Magruder didn't have a huge force at this point.
No, not really. Only about 1,400 men. But he was, starting to dig in. Butler, back at Fort Monroe, he wanted to disrupt that.
So he plans an operation.
A rather ambitious night operation, actually. The Union force he sent out was much larger, maybe 3,500 troops.
Okay, so more than double.
Yeah, but this is key. They were mostly green volunteers. Very little experience. And commanded by a Brigadier General Ebenezer Pierce.
Gotcha. And it's interesting, the packet points out that today, the Bethel Manor Chapel actually sits right near where that 1861 battlefield was.
It does. It gives you a real sense of that history being layered onto the modern landscape, doesn't it?
It really grounds it. Which brings us to the battle itself, or maybe, more accurately, the start of the whole mess. The source uses that classic phrase, the fog of war.
And boy, was it foggy, both literally and figuratively. The Union plan, it was put together by a Major Theodore Winthrop, apparently a Yale grad, sort of an intellectual idealist type.
Okay.
And the plan was complex. It involved multiple columns marching through the night, trying to converge near a place called Little Bethel.
Before moving on to the main target at Big Bethel.
Right. But complexity. At night, with untrained troops and, frankly, inexperienced officers.
Yeah, that just sounds like a recipe for problems.
Mm-hmm.
The packet really highlights the initial confusion. They did have supposed safeguards, things like white armbands and a password. Boston, I think.
Boston, yeah, to try and tell friend from foe in the dark. But that critical information, the identifiers, it just didn't get passed down properly, not to all the units involved.
Oh, boy.
So in the pre-dawn darkness, the absolute worst happened. The 7th New York Infantry mistook the 3rd New York for the enemy, and they opened fire.
Friendly fire, before they even saw a Confederate soldier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The packet is pretty clear about the cost. 2 confirmed deaths, around 19 wounded, just from that one tragic mistake.
Wow.
It named Private George W. Taylor as one of those killed. And chillingly, it notes this was the first Union death of the entire war caused by friendly fire.
That's quite a start. A stark, immediate consequence of that failure, like you said.
Absolutely highlights how crucial clear communication is right from the get-go.
Yeah.
So when the Union forces finally, sort of limped their way up to Big Bethel,
having already suffered casualties.
Right. They basically ran headfirst into Magruder's awaiting defenses.
And Magruder, even though he was outnumbered, he used the situation well.
Brilliantly, according to the source.
Mm-hmm.
Used the terrain, had some basic earthworks dug, and he used some clever tricks.
Like what?
Well, the packet mentions he'd actually pulled his men out of Little Bethel, but left signs of occupation, like campfires maybe, to misdirect the Union forces.
Ah, clever.
And crucially, he positioned concealed artillery near Big Bethel. Hidden batteries to make his force seem stronger, more formidable than it actually was.
So the Union attacks just fell apart.
Pretty much. The packet describes them as disjointed, uncoordinated. They just couldn't break through against those prepared positions and the hidden guns.
It sounds like once they actually got to Big Bethel, the main fight didn't last all that long before it was clear it was a losing effort.
That's the sense you get. Attacks failed, casualties started mounting, and Brigadier General Pierce eventually had to order a retreat all the way back to Fort Monroe.
So a clear Confederate win, tactically speaking.
Oh, yeah, definitely. A small one, but clear. And the numbers really tell that story. Union suffered about 76 casualties total, 18 killed, 53 wounded, 5 missing.
Okay, and the Confederates?
Minimal losses, just 1 killed and 7 wounded.
Wow, that's stark. The packet calls out a couple of notable individuals lost.
It does. For the Union, Lieutenant John Trout Gribble. He was a West Point grad and tragically the first regular U.S. Army officer killed in the entire war. Died coordinating artillery fire during the retreat.
And the planner? Winthrop?
Major Theodore Winthrop, yeah. That idealist writer who helped devise the complex plan. He was killed leading a charge near the end.
And on the Confederate side?
Private Harry Lawson Wyatt is highlighted. He was the first Confederate soldier from North Carolina killed in action, and maybe the first enlisted Confederate combat fatality of the war overall.
How did that happen?
He apparently volunteered for a dangerous mission to run out under fire and try to burn down a farmhouse that Union skirmishers were using for cover. He was killed doing it.
That's brave, certainly.
The material also briefly notes the history of the statue erected in his honor back in North Carolina and, its later removal in 2020, reflecting changing perspectives.
Right. So, okay, that's the battle, the history, the sort of what happened. But like we said up front, this packet uses Big Bethel as more than just a historical anecdote. It's a springboard.
Exactly. It makes a clear transition. It moves from just recounting the events to drawing out these deeper, more enduring lessons, particularly around ethics and leadership.
Okay, so let's get into those. The packet connects the dots from that early chaos to, 3 specific ethical themes?
That's right. 3 themes that it argues are still critically important for leaders today.
All right, lay them on us. What's the first one?
First is mission readiness and responsibility. The packet makes a strong case here. It argues that the failed Union plan wasn't just, a tactical screw-up. It frames it as a moral failure.
Okay, why moral? How does it make that jump?
Well, the argument is that ethical judgment for any leader involves properly aligning the complexity of the mission you're ordering with the actual capability and readiness of the people you're sending into harm's way.
Ah, I see.
Pushing unprepared soldiers into a really complicated night operation, wasn't just poor planning in hindsight. The material sees it as a moral failing in the leader's fundamental responsibility to safeguard their subordinates.
So, ambition versus actual readiness.
Yeah.
And the leader's moral duty sits right there in that balance.
Precisely. It's not just about if the plan could theoretically work, but if these troops, right now, were ready for that specific plan.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, the second theme seems to flow directly from that friendly fire tragedy, communication and clarity.
Right. And the packet doesn't really pull any punches here. It explicitly labels unclear communication, especially in high-stakes, high-risk situations, as a moral hazard.
And a moral hazard, that's strong language.
It is. It argues it's not just an operational inefficiency or, a simple mistake. Leaders have a profound moral duty to ensure that orders, intentions, and especially critical information like who's friend and who's foe in the dark are understood clearly, unambiguously, by everyone involved.
Because when lives are on the line, ambiguity itself becomes a moral failing.
That's the core argument.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. And the third theme. It looks at Colonel Magruder's actions, right? The limits of deception in war. He used deception pretty effectively.
He did, and the packet acknowledges, look, deception is a legitimate tool in warfare. It's lawful under the laws of armed conflict. But, and this is the crucial part, it still has ethical boundaries.
What kind of boundaries?
Well, it has to meet tests like military necessity, proportionality. It can't harm civilians unduly. And critically, it can never cross the line into what's called perfidy.
Perfidy, like faking a surrender.
Exactly. Or misusing protected symbols like the Red Cross, things like that. So Magruder's tactics, using fake positions, concealing his artillery, those were generally seen as within the lawful bounds of military deception, a ruse de guerre.
Okay.
But the material still kind of pushes you, the reader, to reflect further. Does exploiting an opponent's disorganization, especially when that disorganization stems from their sheer inexperience, like Pierce's troops, does that raise maybe different ethical questions than exploiting a tactical mistake made by a well-trained, equally capable opponent.
That's a subtle point. Where is the line for honorable conduct, even within lawful actions?
Right. How do you gain military advantage without sacrificing those fundamental standards? It's a challenge for leaders.
And wrapping up these lessons, the packet touches on accountability. It mentions that after the battle, the Union leadership was basically looking for someone to blame.
Yeah, they essentially scapegoated Brigadier General Pierce, put the failure squarely on his shoulders.
Which the packet argues is an ethical lapse in itself.
It does. The point made is that true ethical leadership requires more than just executing orders well, or even just approving plans. It demands owning the consequences, especially when decisions lead to preventable loss of life, like that friendly fire incident.
The buck stops higher up, essentially.
The moral burden rests heavily on those at the top who approved the risky plan and selected the commander, not just on the person trying to carry it out under difficult circumstances.
Okay, this detailed ethical breakdown makes so much more sense now, understanding the context of the source material. This is for a spiritual fitness staff ride. What exactly is a staff ride?
Well, staff rides are actually a pretty fundamental educational tool in many militaries. They have a long history. You can see precursors with Frederick the Great in Poland.
Really? That far back?
Oh, yeah. Clausewitz talks about them in On War. And they were really formalized by Moltke the Elder in Prussia with his classic three-phase method. You study the battle beforehand, you go walk the actual ground, and then you integrate the lessons afterward.
And they're still used today?
Absolutely. Core part of professional military education, PME in the U.S. Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force. It's about understanding decision-making in context.
But these spiritual fitness staff rides, they add another layer.
Exactly. They take that traditional historical analysis of tactics and decisions, and they explicitly weave in principles of ethical warfare and just war doctrine.
So things like necessity, proportionality, distinction between combatants and civilians, humanity.
Precisely. All aligned with current military doctrine, like Joint Publication 3.0 on operations. So while a traditional staff ride might focus heavily on, say, analyzing terrain and troop movements minute by minute,
these put the moral dimensions right up front.
That's the key difference. They challenge participants to step back, look at those historical decisions not just through a tactical lens, but through an ethical and, yes, a spiritual one, asking, was this right? Not just, was this effective?
What's the ultimate goal, then?
The stated goal is to help develop military personnel not just as skilled warfighters, but as leaders grounded in moral clarity. Leaders who are better prepared to make those incredibly tough ethical calls under the immense pressure of modern conflict.
And the packet even mentions future tech like VR or AR.
Yeah, it just briefly touches on how immersive technologies might make this kind of ethical exploration even more powerful in the future. Imagine virtually standing on the battlefield facing those dilemmas.
That's fascinating. Using history not just for tactical lessons learned, but for grappling with the human and moral cost of command decisions.
Exactly. Which brings us, I think, very neatly to the final piece here, how these lessons from 1861 still echo today. The packet uses a fictional story to bridge that gap.
Right. Echoes over Luzon. Tell us about that.
Okay, so this story shifts us to the present day, or near future. Puts us in the shoes of a Captain Mig Santos. He's an intelligence officer. And he's dealing with rising tensions in the Pacific, specifically with Chinese actions described as gray zone operations.
Gray zone. So actions that are hostile or coercive, but designed to stay below the threshold of actual armed conflict.
Exactly. Often involving disinformation, cyber attacks, maritime militias, economic pressure, and crucially for this story, deception.
Okay, so what's Miggs facing?
He and his team intercept what looks like a really convincing intelligence picture. Spoofed signals, fake radio chatter, all pointing towards an imminent major amphibious invasion near Palawan in the Philippines.
Wow. High stakes.
Extremely high. And the immediate pressure from his commanders is intense. We need to react now, show strength.
But Miggs isn't sure.
He's got that nagging doubt, that gut feeling backed by some subtle indicators maybe, that it's just too perfect, that it might be a deliberately crafted ruse designed specifically to provoke the U.S. into an overreaction.
To trick them into making a strategic mistake.
Precisely. So he's caught in this terrible dilemma. If it's real, inaction is disastrous. But if it's a bluff, reacting forcefully could trigger exactly the kind of escalation they want to avoid. It's an agonizing leadership position.
It's the fog of war, just updated for the 21st century. Ambiguity fueled by digital noise and deliberate deception, not just darkness and smoke.
Absolutely. And the pressure for a snap decision is immense. But like the leaders, or perhaps unlike some leaders at Big Bethel, Miggs has to make a critical judgment call under that intense pressure.
What does he do?
He makes the really tough recommendation. Hold back. Let's do more analysis. Let's verify this with other assets, drones or satellites, things not reliant on the potentially compromised signal's intelligence. He insists on seeking confirmation because, as he puts it, he has high confidence in deception indicators.
Takes guts to push back against commanders demanding immediate action.
It really does. And in the story, his caution pays off. They get confirmation.
Yeah.
And it turns out the invasion force was entirely fake. Decoys, inflatable tanks on barges, synthetic electronic signals, all designed purely to deceive and provoke.
Wow. So by holding the line, resisting that pressure for a premature reaction, they avoided a potentially catastrophic escalation based on a lie.
Exactly. And the story explicitly connects Miggs's modern challenge right back to those lessons drawn from Big Bethel in the packet.
How so?
Well, it highlights the ongoing, maybe even increased ethical cost of miscommunication and ambiguity in modern conflict. It revisits the ethics of deception, but this time focusing on recognizing and countering it when used by an adversary.
Okay.
And maybe most importantly, it underscores that heavy ethical burden of leadership judgment, making calls in moments of profound uncertainty when the stakes are incredibly high.
Does the story include any specific takeaways from Miggs himself?
Yeah, there are a few lines that really resonate, and they sound like they could have come straight from that analysis of Big Bethel. Things like, miscommunication in war is not just a tactical risk, it's a moral one. Lives depend on clarity. No assumptions, no shortcuts. It's hard. Anything else? He reflects on the leader's role, knowing when to pull the trigger and when not to. And this idea that the harder road, the road of restraint, of careful verification, is sometimes the only honorable one. He defines leadership as existing in that space, the space where judgment holds the line.
Wow. It's actually incredibly powerful how this small, confusing, frankly messy battle from 1861, when seen through this specific lens of ethical and spiritual fitness, provides such a clear framework for understanding these absolutely timeless leadership challenges, even with all the massive changes in technology and the global landscape.
It really does. It demonstrates that while the tools and the tactics evolve constantly, the fundamental human and ethical dimensions of command, navigating uncertainty, dealing with fear and confusion, bearing the moral weight of your decisions, those remain remarkably constant across centuries.
So, to kind of wrap this up then, Big Bethel, a battle that was small in scale, maybe even forgettable in the grand sweep of the Civil War, but when you examine it through the ethical and spiritual fitness framework presented in this material we've been discussing, it yields some pretty immense lessons.
It really emphasizes the value of looking at history, not just for, what went wrong tactically on the battlefield, but for the human side, the moral side, the leadership dimensions of conflict, and the real consequences of choices made under extreme duress.
And these aren't just abstract military concepts, are they? I mean, they connect directly to you, the listener, whether you're leading a small team at work, managing a crisis in your community, or just making difficult personal decisions.
Right.
That need for clear communication, for honestly assessing readiness, your own or your team's, for understanding the ethical boundaries of any strategy, and for taking genuine accountability. Those things are vital whenever judgment is required under pressure, whenever the stakes feel high.
Absolutely. The context changes dramatically, but those core principles of responsible ethical leadership, they endure.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? What does ethical leadership truly demand from us, especially in those tough moments? Moments of failure or just profound uncertainty when the consequences, whatever they may be, are significant, maybe even life or death.